Pinsor doesn't see the giant destructor ball. Is this the end of Dargon's loyal friend? Watch the next episode of Sectaurs by Coleco.
How did one of the most ambitious toy lines of the 1980s become a commercial failure almost as quickly as it arrived, despite having some of the most creative ideas ever seen in a toy aisle? So in 1985, the toy industry was a battlefield. You had He-Man, Transformers, and G.I. Joe dominating store shelves, television screens, and playground conversations. And every major company wanted the next giant franchise because the rewards were, let's be honest, enormous. Now, if a toy line connected with kids, it didn't just sell toys. It created cartoons, it created comics, and it created lunchboxes and entire worlds. And one company believed it had created something different enough to compete with the giants. That toy line was Sectaurs. And unlike almost everything else around it, it wasn't built around robots, soldiers, or superheroes. It was built around giant insects.
Each warrior comes with his own telebonded insectoid that you control, like Bytor. Winged flies into the heat of battle.
Now, at first glance, the concept sounded risky. A fantasy world filled with insect-like warriors and massive bug creatures, well, it didn't exactly seem like the safest idea for a mainstream toy line. But that strange concept was also what made Sectaurs unforgettable. Because these weren't just action figures. They were part action figure, part puppet, and part fantasy epic. And for a brief moment, it looked like they might actually become the next huge thing. So, the story began with Coleco, a company riding an unpredictable wave of success and failure during the early 1980s. And on one side, they had experienced enormous hits like Cabbage Patch Kids. On the other, they had suffered major financial disasters in electronics and home gaming. And the company desperately needed another blockbuster, especially in the boys' toy aisle where competitors were making absolute fortunes. So, Coleco went looking for something unique. Now, the original spark reportedly came from creature designer Tim Clark, who had experience building puppets and fantasy creatures. And one of his creations, a fly hand puppet, eventually inspired a larger idea. Instead of giving action figures vehicles or animals to ride, what if the creatures themselves were interactive puppets? And that concept immediately stood out. And from there, the creators built an entire universe around it. The world was called Symbion, a planet devastated by a catastrophic event that transformed its insects into gigantic creatures and altered its humanoid inhabitants. And out of that destruction came two opposing factions, the heroic Shining Realm and the evil Dark Domain. But what really separated Sectaurs from other toy lines was the depth of its lore. Because the warriors weren't just riding giant insects, they were physically bonded to them. The relationship between rider and creature was emotional and physical, and if one suffered, the other felt it too. Now, for a toy line aimed at kids, it was surprisingly dark and ambitious storytelling, and that ambition extended directly into the toys themselves. So when Sectaurs launched in 1985, the figures instantly looked different from everything else on the shelves. They were larger than many competing action figures and packed with detail. Their armor, their weapons, and their insect-like features gave them an alien appearance that felt both fantasy-inspired and slightly unsettling. But the real stars were the insect creatures. Instead of hard plastic vehicles, the larger bugs were designed as massive hand puppets, and kids could slide their hands inside and directly control the creature's movement. Legs moved, mandibles snapped, and wings flapped. Toys felt alive in a way most action figures simply didn't. And at the time, there was really nothing else like them. And visually, they were impossible to ignore. The bugs were furry, they were textured, and they were definitely strange. Some looked exciting, others looked genuinely creepy, but either way, kids noticed them immediately. Coleco also understood that a toy line alone wasn't enough to survive in the 1980s. Successful franchises needed media support, so the company followed the same strategy that worked for other major brands. An animated miniseries introduced audiences to the world of Symbion. Comics expanded the lore even further, and everything was designed to convince kids that Sectaurs wasn't just a toy line, it was a full fantasy universe. And for a moment, it really seemed like the strategy might work. The toy stood out, the world felt unique, and the interactivity was unlike anything else on the market. But underneath that creativity was a problem that became impossible to ignore. You see, the toys were expensive, very expensive. All that size, all that detail, and all that puppetry came with a cost, and compared to smaller action figures like G.I. Joe or even many Masters of the Universe toys, Sectaurs asked parents to spend significantly more money. And in a market driven heavily by collecting, that mattered. Kids could build armies of smaller figures more easily than they could collect expensive insect warriors and giant puppet bugs. What made Sectaurs impressive also made it harder to grow into a massive repeat purchase toy line. And at the same time, the aesthetic itself created another challenge. You see, the insect theme was fascinating to some kids, but actually uncomfortable to others. Not every parent wanted to buy giant furry bug monsters covered in legs and mandibles. While the strange appearance helped the toy line stand out, it also actually limited its mainstream appeal. And then came the biggest problem of all. The cartoon disappeared too quickly. Unlike Transformers or G.I. Joe, which had constant television exposure through ongoing series, Sectaurs only received a short animated run. And once those episodes stopped airing, the franchise lost the consistent visibility needed to stay alive in kids' minds. And that loss was devastating, because in the 1980s, cartoons weren't just entertainment, they were advertising. Every new episode kept the toys relevant. Every rerun reminded kids to keep collecting. Without that constant reinforcement, Sectaurs struggled to maintain momentum. And once toy lines lose momentum, well, things collapse fast. Retailers started ordering less inventory, future waves of toys were cancelled. New characters and creatures that had already been designed never officially reached stores. And for collectors today, those unreleased prototypes became legendary pieces of toy history, a glimpse into what the line might have become if it had survived longer. But the problems surrounding Sectaurs were also connected to something much larger. Coleco itself was collapsing. Years of financial problems had pushed the company into dangerous territory, and failed business decisions outside the toy aisle were draining money rapidly. The company needed a massive hit to stabilize itself. Sectaurs, unfortunately, wasn't that hit. And when it failed to become the next major franchise, the consequences were severe. By the late 1980s, Coleco filed for bankruptcy. And with the collapse of the company, the world of Symbion disappeared too. Well, at least for a while, because despite its short lifespan, Sectaurs left a powerful impression on the kids who experienced it. And part of that came from how unique the line felt. It didn't look like anything else from the era. The puppet bugs, the darker storytelling, and the strange fantasy world gave it an identity that stood apart from the competition. And over time, that uniqueness transformed into cult status, because collectors began hunting for original figures and insect toys, especially complete sets with working puppet features intact. And the toys that once struggled to sell became highly sought-after pieces of 1980s nostalgia. And eventually, companies started noticing that dedicated fanbase. So years later, revival attempts began appearing. Smaller-scale versions returned first, proving there was still interest in the property, but then came something much bigger. A modern company acquired the license and announced plans to bring back Sectaurs while staying faithful to the original vision. New figures returned to the larger scale, updated insect puppets were developed using modern technology, and even characters cancelled during the original run were finally given official releases decades later. And that revival says something important about Sectaurs. The line may have failed commercially, but creatively it left a lasting remark. Because Sectaurs represented a kind of ambition that rarely survives in the toy industry. It was weird, it was risky, and it was expensive, and completely unlike anything else around it. So what caused the rise and fall of Sectaurs? Well, the rise came from bold creativity, innovative design, and a willingness to take risks in a crowded market. The fall came from high prices, niche appeal, weak long-term media support, and the financial collapse of the company behind it. But the legacy survived, because sometimes the most unforgettable toy lines aren't the ones that dominate forever. Sometimes they're the strange, ambitious experiments that burned brightly for a moment and never looked like anything else again.